Stephen Blake had always been a man of purpose. He thrived on structure, responsibilities, and a sense of duty. Every waking moment seemed tethered to a single goal, securing a future for his daughter, Emma. Her college dreams had become his mission, and every late shift, every skipped vacation, was another brick laid on the path to her success. But lately, a nagging disquiet had settled in the corners of Stephen's mind. Little things didn't add up. Rachel, his wife of 22 years, had grown distant, not cold, but absent in ways that were hard to describe. Emma, once bubbly and talkative, now seemed evasive, as if her words were carefully measured. Stephen had learned to ignore these feelings. They weren't practical. He believed in the honesty of his family as much as he believed in hard work. And yet, the gnawing unease was there, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. It was a Thursday evening when his world began to shift. Stephen had left work early, an unusual occurrence prompted by a last-minute meeting cancellation. He decided to surprise Rachel with takeout from Bella Vita, her favorite Italian spot. He could already picture her face lighting up at the sight of the pasta primavera and tiramisu she adored. He carried the fragrant bags up to the front door of their modest suburban home. As he reached for the handle, he paused, noticing the door was slightly ajar. A faint, urgent murmur drifted through the gap. Stephen hesitated. He wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the tone of the voices inside stopped him cold. Emma's voice, tight and nervous, rose above the murmur. "Mom, this can't go on. He's going to find out eventually." Stephen's stomach twisted. His first thought was about Emma's school, a problem with tuition. Grades. He instinctively wanted to push open the door and offer reassurance. Whatever it was, they'd figure it out together. That was what families did. Then Rachel's voice followed, soft but edged with anxiety. "I know, Emma. But your dad, he'd never understand. He's too straightforward. Too trusting." Stephen's hand froze on the doorknob. Trusting? What did she mean by that? Emma sighed audibly. "I hate this. Covering for you, lying to him, it's not fair." Rachel's response was a whisper, barely audible over the thundering of Stephen's pulse. "You're the only one who can help me right now. Please. Just a little longer." The air felt heavy, pressing against Stephen's chest. He didn't want to hear more, but he couldn't force himself to move. For the first time in years, the foundation of his home, his sanctuary, felt unsteady, as if something critical was cracking beneath its surface. Before he could process what he was hearing, the voices fell silent. Footsteps approached the door. Stephen snapped into action, stepping off the porch and noisily setting the bags down to mask his presence. Then he turned the handle and stepped inside, calling out in his usual cheerful tone, "I'm home." Rachel was in the kitchen by the time he entered, her face lighting up in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Stephen. You're home early. What a nice surprise." "I thought I'd bring dinner," he said, holding up the bags. He glanced toward the hallway, catching a fleeting glimpse of Emma as she hurriedly ascended the stairs, her head down and shoulders tense. "Emma, sweetie. No dinner with us tonight," he called after her. "I've got a ton of work to do, Dad," she replied without turning around. "Maybe later." Stephen's gaze lingered on her retreating figure. Emma had always been close to him, sharing everything from her college struggles to her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Lately, she'd been pulling away, but this moment felt different. It was almost as if she couldn't look him in the eye. Rachel began unpacking the takeout, her movements brisk and purposeful. "How was work?" she asked, her voice overly casual. Stephen forced a smile. "Same as always. Meetings and reports. How about your day?" "Oh, Rachel said breezily. "Errands, cleaning, catching up on some shows. Nothing exciting." He watched her as she laid out the plates and silverware. Every gesture was normal, every word innocuous, and yet it all felt rehearsed, as though she were sticking to a script. Dinner was quiet but polite, filled with the usual small talk about work and weather. Stephen felt like an outsider in his own home, observing a performance meant to keep him in the dark. That night, as Rachel slept beside him, Stephen stared at the ceiling. His mind replayed the snippets of conversation he'd overheard, each word a jagged edge slicing through his thoughts. What could Rachel and Emma be hiding from him? He thought about the trust he'd placed in his wife, the years they'd spent building a life together. The idea that she could betray that trust felt impossible. And yet, by morning, Stephen had made up his mind. He wasn't going to confront Rachel or Emma, not yet. Whatever was happening, he needed to understand it fully before he acted. And for that, he needed to gather proof. Stephen's morning began like any other, the hiss of the coffee machine, the muffled sound of the news on the TV, and Rachel humming softly as she sliced fruit for breakfast. But beneath the surface of these mundane rituals, Stephen's thoughts churned. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss that held answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Rachel greeted him with her usual warmth, offering him a slice of toast with butter. "Busy day at work?" she asked, her tone casual, her eyes betraying nothing. Stephen nodded, forcing a smile. "Same as always. Deadlines, reports. You know how it is." Rachel chuckled lightly and poured herself a second cup of coffee. She moved with her usual ease, her demeanor calm and composed. But to Stephen, her every word and action felt deliberate, calculated to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Emma appeared in the doorway, her hair still damp from a quick shower. "Morning," she mumbled, grabbing a granola bar from the counter. Her backpack was already slung over one shoulder, her keys jingling in her hand. "You're leaving already?" Stephen asked, glancing at the clock. It was earlier than usual. "I've got a study group before class," Emma replied, her voice hurried. She avoided meeting his gaze, fiddling with the strap of her backpack. Stephen's heart sank. "Well, let me know if you need anything. Lunch money? A ride home later?" "No, I'm good," Emma said quickly. "Thanks, Dad. Bye." Stephen watched her leave, her movements tense and hurried, as though she couldn't wait to escape. When the door closed behind her, he turned back to Rachel, who was washing her coffee cup at the sink. "She's been so busy lately," Stephen said, testing the waters. "I feel like I hardly see her anymore." Rachel shrugged without turning around. "College life. You remember how it was, always something to do." Stephen didn't reply. He sipped his coffee in silence, his thoughts circling back to the conversation he'd overheard. The words hung in his mind like a storm cloud, "Your dad would never understand." When Rachel left for her volunteer shift at the community center, Stephen sat at the kitchen table, staring at the door long after it had closed. He knew he couldn't let this go. Whatever was happening, whatever his wife and daughter were hiding, he needed to know the truth. He started in the bedroom. Guilt twisted in his gut as he rifled through Rachel's nightstand, but he couldn't let that stop him. Underneath a stack of folded scarves and jewelry boxes, he found a small leather-bound journal. Its edges were worn, and the clasp was delicate and ornamental. Rachel wasn't one to keep a diary, or at least, not that he'd ever known. Stephen hesitated, the weight of the journal heavy in his hands. Part of him wanted to put it back, to respect her privacy. But then he remembered Emma's words, "I hate covering for you." With a deep breath, he opened the clasp and flipped to the first page. The entries started innocuously, lists of errands, thoughts about Emma's college plans, notes about their grocery budget. But then Stephen's eyes landed on a passage that made his blood run cold. "Nolan says I need to decide soon. He's been so patient, but I can tell he's getting frustrated. I don't blame him. Stephen is such a good man, and Emma loves her father, but how much longer can I live this lie? I feel trapped, and I hate myself for what I'm doing to both of them." Stephen's hands shook as he reread the entry. Nolan. The name was unfamiliar, yet it carried a weight that made Stephen's chest tighten. He flipped through the journal, scanning for more mentions of the name. There were scattered references, vague notes about meetings and whispered conversations, but no clear explanations. By the time Stephen closed the journal, his heart was pounding. The implications were devastating, but he still didn't have the full picture. Who was Nolan? A colleague? A friend? Or something worse? Stephen decided to access Rachel's laptop. He knew her password, it was Emma's name and birth year, the same combination she'd used for years. Once inside, he began searching through her emails. Most of them were innocuous, messages about community events, recipes, and school updates. But then he found a folder labeled N. Personal. His breath caught as he opened it. The emails inside were brief but damning. From Nolan. "I can't keep waiting, Rachel. You need to make a decision. This isn't fair to either of us." Rachel's reply. "I know. Please be patient." It's not that simple. Stephen clenched his fists, the words blurring on the screen. Another email caught his attention, this one dated several months earlier. From Nolan. Emma's been great about covering for us, but I don't think she can handle the stress much longer. She's just a kid, Rachel. This isn't fair to her. Stephen stared at the screen, his chest tightening with anger and heartbreak. His daughter wasn't just aware of Rachel's secret, she was complicit. The realization was like a knife to the heart. Stephen spent the rest of the day grappling with the weight of what he'd discovered. That evening, as Rachel sat across from him at the dinner table, laughing softly at one of his jokes, Stephen felt a cold determination settle over him. He couldn't confront her yet, not until he had everything he needed. The following morning, Stephen decided to follow Rachel. He waited until she left for her next volunteer shift, then trailed her car at a safe distance. She drove to a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place they'd never been to together. Parking discreetly, Stephen watched as she entered the cafe and greeted a man sitting in the corner. Nolan. Stephen recognized him immediately. He was Emma's college mentor, someone they'd met during her first year. At the time, Stephen had admired the man's dedication to his students. Now, the sight of him laughing with Rachel made Stephen's stomach turn. For an hour, Stephen watched them through the cafe window. Their body language was intimate but cautious, subtle gestures and close whispers that spoke volumes. When Rachel finally left, Stephen remained behind, watching as Nolan paid the bill and exited the cafe. Stephen's suspicions were no longer suspicions, they were truths. And those truths demanded action. That night, Stephen began compiling everything, photos, emails, journal entries. He worked late into the night, fueled by a cold, methodical rage. This wasn't just about Rachel's betrayal. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal of the family he'd worked so hard to protect. When dawn broke, Stephen sat back and surveyed the evidence he had gathered. He wasn't just going to confront Rachel, he was going to expose her. And Emma would face the consequences of her complicity. The trap was set. Now, all Stephen had to do was wait. Stephen woke up earlier than usual, the heaviness in his chest sharper than the morning chill that seeped through the window. The confrontation with Emma the day before lingered in his mind, her tearful explanations replaying like a broken record. He wanted to believe her, that she'd been manipulated, pressured into complicity by her mother's desperate pleas. But the betrayal still cut deep, and forgiveness felt miles away. His family was crumbling before his eyes, and he wasn't sure if it could be salvaged, or if he even wanted to try. Rachel greeted him in the kitchen with her usual warmth, the kind that now felt more like an act. She placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, her cheerful humming grating against his nerves. He studied her movements carefully, noting how she glanced at her phone every few minutes, her lips twitching into a faint, fleeting smile. "I was thinking of making lasagna tonight," Rachel said casually. "It's been a while since we've had a proper family dinner." Stephen forced a smile. "Sounds good. I might be late, though, lots to catch up on at work." Her expression faltered, just for a moment. "Oh. Well, I'll keep it warm." It was small, almost imperceptible, but Stephen caught it, the quick flicker of disappointment in her eyes. He wondered if it was because he disrupted her plans with Nolan or because she genuinely missed their old family routines. Either way, he had no intention of letting her know he'd noticed. After Rachel left for her volunteer shift, Stephen returned to his office. The folder of evidence sat on his desk, the damning photographs and emails staring back at him like an accusation. It was all there, proof of Rachel's affair, Emma's involvement, and Nolan's role as the catalyst for their family's unraveling. Yet it felt incomplete. He wanted more. Something undeniable, something that would strip Rachel and Nolan of any defense when the time came. He decided to pay a visit to Nolan's office. The man worked as a mentor and advisor at the college Emma attended, a position that had seemed admirable when they'd first met him years ago. Now, the thought of Nolan guiding young minds made Stephen's stomach churn. The campus was quiet when Stephen arrived, most students holed up in the library or their dorms preparing for midterms. He parked a safe distance from the building and waited, watching as people came and went. It wasn't long before he spotted Nolan stepping out of the entrance, a phone pressed to his ear. Stephen's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he observed the man who had upended his life. Nolan was tall and well-groomed, with the kind of confidence that made people gravitate toward him. Stephen hated him instantly. When Nolan ended his call and walked toward a nearby coffee shop, Stephen followed at a careful distance. He chose a seat in the corner of the cafe, far enough to avoid detection but close enough to overhear Nolan's conversation as he met with a young woman. They spoke in hushed tones, but Stephen could make out enough. The woman was a student, likely one of Nolan's ments, and their discussion sounded innocent enough at first, talk of coursework, future plans, and career aspirations. But then Nolan's tone shifted, becoming warmer, more personal. He leaned in closer, his hand briefly grazing hers as he laughed at something she said. Stephen's jaw tightened. It was subtle, but he recognized the signs. Nolan was grooming her, just as he'd likely done with Rachel. The realization solidified something within Stephen. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore, this man was a predator, a manipulator who thrived on exploiting vulnerabilities. When Nolan finally left the cafe, Stephen followed him again, this time snapping photos from a distance. He wasn't sure if they'd be useful, but he wanted a record of everything. By the time he returned home, it was late, and Rachel was already asleep. Stephen sat in his car for a long time, staring at the house that had once been his sanctuary. He thought about the years he'd spent building a life with Rachel, the sacrifices he'd made to ensure Emma had every opportunity. Now, it all felt hollow, a carefully constructed facade that had been crumbling behind his back. The next day, Stephen called Emma into his office. She seemed wary, her eyes darting nervously around the room as she sat across from him. "I need to ask you something," Stephen said, his voice calm but firm. "And I want the truth this time." Emma nodded hesitantly. "Okay. How long has this been going on?" Her lips trembled, and for a moment, Stephen thought she might break down again. But instead, she straightened her posture, her expression hardening. "A year, maybe a little longer. I don't know exactly." Stephen's heart sank. "And you knew the whole time?" "I didn't at first," Emma admitted. "Mom was careful. But eventually, I figured it out. She begged me not to tell you. She said it would destroy you, that it was better if you didn't know." "And you believed her," Stephen said bitterly. Emma's voice rose defensively. "What was I supposed to do, Dad? She's my mom. I didn't want to hurt you." Stephen leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And what about now, Emma? Do you still think keeping this secret is protecting me?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. I was wrong. I see that now." Stephen's expression softened, but only slightly. "I need you to promise me something. No more lies. No more secrets. From now on, you tell me everything." Emma nodded through her tears. "I promise." Later that evening, Stephen prepared for the next phase of his plan. He called an old friend, someone who specialized in private investigations. The man owed Stephen a favor, and Stephen intended to cash it in. He wanted everything on Nolan, his history, his finances, anything that could expose the man for what he truly was. By the time Rachel returned from her shift, Stephen had composed himself. He greeted her with a smile, even as his mind churned with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. She seemed relieved, as if she believed the tension between them was finally easing. Stephen let her believe it. For now. Stephen felt the weight of his plan settling heavily on his shoulders as he stared at the evidence laid out before him. Each photo, email, and text was a reminder of the lies he'd been living with for months. His decision to take action had brought a grim determination, but it also left him grappling with a painful question: once the truth was out, what would be left of his family? Would Emma ever forgive him for dragging her into this? Would Rachel try to salvage what they had, or would she double down on her betrayal? He couldn't afford to let these doubts deter him. The time for reflection had passed. Now, it was time for execution. The following morning, Stephen sent Rachel and Emma on their separate ways as if nothing was amiss. He kissed Rachel on the cheek as she left for another volunteer shift, the softness of her touch almost enough to make him falter. Almost. Emma left shortly after, her demeanor cautious but resigned after their recent conversation. Once they were gone, Stephen grabbed the neatly packed folder of evidence and headed to the college campus. He wasn't sure what to expect, but his gut told him that Nolan wouldn't be able to talk his way out of this. At the college, Stephen walked through the bustling courtyard with purpose. The campus hummed with the sound of students chatting, music playing faintly from speakers, and the occasional whoosh of a bicycle speeding past. Stephen felt out of place in his business casual attire, a sharp contrast to the youthful energy around him. When he reached Nolan's office building, Stephen paused. His heart pounded as he considered his next move. He wasn't here to cause a scene, or so he told himself. But as he thought about the emails, the lies, and the role Nolan had played in appending his life, Stephen felt a surge of anger that threatened to overwhelm his restraint. He pushed the door open and stepped into the academic advisor's office suite. The receptionist looked up, smiling politely. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Nolan," Stephen said, his voice steady but firm. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated. "I believe he's in a meeting right now. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'll wait," Stephen replied. His tone left no room for argument. She nodded, clearly uneasy, and gestured toward a row of chairs along the wall. Stephen sat, his eyes fixed on the door marked Nolan Harding, student advisor. The minutes stretched, each one punctuated by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Stephen's grip tightened on the folder in his lap, the edges of the paper digging into his fingers. Finally, the door opened, and a student exited, followed by Nolan. He looked every bit the polished professional, his tailored suit, neatly combed hair, and charismatic smile radiating an aura of trustworthiness. Stephen felt a surge of disgust. "Mr. Harding?" Stephen stood, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Nolan turned, his smile faltering slightly as he took in Stephen's imposing presence. "Yes. How can I help you?" Stephen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "We need to talk. Privately." Nolan hesitated, glancing at the receptionist, who looked equally uncomfortable. Finally, he nodded. "Of course. Come into my office." Stephen followed him inside, closing the door firmly behind him. Nolan gestured to a chair, but Stephen remained standing. "What's this about?" Nolan asked, his tone cautious but still friendly. Stephen dropped the folder onto the desk between them. "I think you know exactly what this is about." Nolan's expression shifted, the mask of confidence slipping as he opened the folder and began flipping through its contents. His face paled, his jaw tightening as he took in the photos and messages. "You've been seeing my wife," Stephen said, his voice low and controlled. "You've been lying to her. Manipulating her. And you dragged my daughter into it." Nolan's hands froze over the pages. "Stephen." "Don't," Stephen snapped, his voice rising. "Don't try to deny it. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is something it isn't." Nolan leaned back in his chair, his composure faltering. "I never meant for this to happen. Rachel and I." "Rachel and you?" Stephen cut him off. "Rachel and you destroyed my family. Do you have any idea what you've done? The damage you've caused?" Nolan rubbed a hand over his face, his polished demeanor crumbling. "I care about Rachel. I care about Emma. I didn't want them to get hurt." Stephen slammed his hands on the desk, making Nolan flinch. "Hurt? You think this is about sparing their feelings? You use them, both of them, for your own selfish needs." Nolan opened his mouth to respond, but Stephen wasn't finished. "Here's how this is going to go. You're going to walk away from Rachel and Emma. No more meetings, no more messages, no more lies. If I see or hear of you contacting them again, I'll make sure every single person in this building knows exactly what you are. And trust me, Nolan, I've got plenty of evidence to back it up." Nolan swallowed hard, his confidence thoroughly shattered. "Stephen, please. Let's be reasonable." "This is me being reasonable," Stephen said coldly. "You don't want to see what happens if I stop." Stephen left the office feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't enough to repair the damage Nolan had done, but it was a start. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. That evening, as Rachel prepared dinner, Stephen waited for the right moment to act. When she set down the plates and sat across from him, he reached for the folder he'd brought home. Rachel looked up, her brow furrowing as he placed it on the table between them. "What's that?" she asked cautiously. Stephen met her gaze, his voice steady. "It's time we had a conversation." Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting toward the folder. She knew. Even before she opened it, she knew what was coming. As she flipped through the pages, her face turned pale, her hands trembling. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at Stephen, her voice breaking. I can explain. I don't want explanations, Stephen said sharply. I want the truth. Rachel stared at him, her composure cracking under the weight of his gaze. Finally, she lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, hollow and insufficient. Stephen's jaw tightened as he prepared for the confrontation that would finally shatter the illusion of their life together. This time, there would be no turning back. The tension in the room was unbearable, silence filling the air like a thick fog. Rachel's whispered apology hung there, insufficient and meaningless in the face of everything Stephen had uncovered. Her hands trembled as they rested on the folder, but she made no effort to close it, no attempt to defend herself. Stephen's voice was cold, almost unfamiliar, as he spoke. Do you even know what you're sorry for, Rachel? Are you sorry you betrayed me? Sorry you lied to me? Or are you just sorry that you got caught? Rachel's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face etched with anguish. Stephen, it's not that simple. It's not that simple, he interrupted, his voice rising. You lied to my face for months. You dragged our daughter into your deceit. You let another man sit across from you and call himself something more than a stranger in our lives. What part of that is complicated? Rachel choked on her sobs. I didn't plan for this to happen. Nolan, he gave me something I thought I'd lost. I was lonely, Stephen. You were so wrapped up in work, in Emma's college bills, in everything else. I felt invisible. Invisible? Stephen's laugh was bitter, scornful. I was working myself to the bone for you and Emma. For this family. Do you know how many hours I put in to make sure you never had to worry about a thing? And you repay me by destroying everything? Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Stephen held up a hand, silencing her. No. I'm not done. You're going to listen now. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed Emma. You used her as a shield, forced her to cover for you. She's a child, Rachel. Our child. And you put her in a position no daughter should ever have to face. How do you even begin to justify that? Rachel's sobs quieted as she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I thought I was protecting her. I didn't want her to hate me. Protecting her? Stephen's voice cracked with anger. You've scarred her, Rachel. She may never trust us again, not me, not you, not anyone. Do you even realize what you've done to her? The sound of a door opening upstairs interrupted them. Both turned to see Emma standing at the top of the staircase, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red. She'd heard everything. I already don't trust you, Emma said, her voice trembling but resolute. Either of you. Emma, Rachel pleaded, standing up. Sweetheart, please. I never wanted this to hurt you. Emma's lip quivered, and her eyes narrowed. You didn't want to hurt me. Then why did you use me to cover for you? Why did you make me lie to Dad, over and over, when you knew what it would do to him? To us. Stephen stood, his anger giving way to sorrow as he reached out to his daughter. Emma, I'm so sorry you were caught in this. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you better. Emma's gaze flickered to her father, her defenses softening for a moment, but she quickly straightened. I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know if I can believe either of you. Rachel approached Emma, her voice desperate. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I love you, Emma. I love this family. Emma stepped back, tears streaming down her face. You didn't love this family enough to stop. Her words hung like a dagger in the air. Rachel froze, her hands falling limply to her sides. Stephen's throat tightened as he watched his daughter descend the stairs, her every step heavy with pain and anger. When Emma reached the bottom, she turned to Stephen. I can't stay here tonight. I need space. Stephen nodded, his heart breaking. Take my car. Call me if you need anything. Emma didn't respond. She grabbed her jacket and keys, casting one last glance at her parents before walking out the door. The sound of the engine starting was a bitter reminder of how far their family had fallen. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel sank onto the couch, her sobs returning with renewed force. What have I done? She whispered, her voice raw. Stephen stood across the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. You've destroyed us, Rachel. You've destroyed everything we had. I can fix it, she said, almost to herself. I can make it right. Please, Stephen, let me try. Stephen's expression hardened. You think this is something you can fix? You think words and promises can undo the damage you've caused? Rachel looked up at him, desperation etched into her face. I'll leave Nolan. I'll do anything. Just don't give up on us. Stephen's voice was calm, almost detached. It's too late for that, Rachel. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. He walked past her to the door, grabbing his jacket. I'll be staying somewhere else tonight. You'll hear from my lawyer soon. Rachel's sobs grew louder as she realized the finality of his words. Stephen, please. Don't do this. But Stephen didn't look back. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Rachel alone with her regrets. Stephen sat in his car, staring at the darkened street ahead. The pain of the confrontation was overwhelming, but beneath it was a faint sense of liberation. For too long, he'd been trapped in a web of lies, clinging to a family that no longer existed. Now, as the first steps toward rebuilding his life loomed ahead, he felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know what the future held, for himself, for Emma, or even for Rachel. But he knew one thing: the truth had finally come to light, and from the ashes of betrayal, something new could rise. Whether that something was redemption or simply survival, only time would tell.